I'm one of many, many pastors and church leaders and Christians here who are in huge debt to BioLogos and to Deb and to Francis, and wish very much we could spend this chunk of time listening to Francis talk more, but we can't. So I was asked to talk about faith and science and public witness. We live in a time of increasing polarization, especially when it comes to faith. Those on the left are concerned about masses of people, often in the middle of the country, who out of fear cling to guns and God or resist good science. Those on the right complain often about elitists, cultural gatekeepers in the media and the academy that tend to be disproportionately secularist and hostile to faith. Sociologist Peter Berger famously wrote that if Sweden is the world's most secular country and India its most religious country, America is a country of Indians being governed by Swedes. I minister in a fabulous part of the world that prizes technology and science and education and learning and the life of the mind, where people will often assume that if a person is someone of faith, it means being uneducated. I was on a plane a while ago and had a long conversation with a very secular seatmate. He was educated in science. He was working in technology. He was struggling with how to raise his children with a moral compass and how to process the death of his father and what was the purpose of his own life. He was very clearly unchurched, and the longer we talked, the more clearly unchurched he was. And after over an hour, he asked the inevitable question, "What do you do?" And when I told him I was a pastor, he said, this is a precise quote, "I'll be damned." And I said, well, I hope not. Let's talk about that for a while, because that's a good question. So I want to talk for a while as a pastor. I can't speak on any other authority, but I can as a pastor in a church in a world that is thrilled and confused and curious about science as well as the great questions. And I want to talk about 4 gifts that I think those of us who follow Jesus, especially church leaders, especially pastors, but more broadly, need to be giving to the church and to our broader world. And the first one echoes something Deb has already talked about, and that is a gift of humility, especially about what we do not know. I grew up in the church. I grew up in a Baptist church, and I'm very grateful, but it did not always prize the life of the mind. I went to Fuller Seminary to get a PhD in clinical psychology, and a woman in our church asked me when I said I was doing that, "Why do you need to study Freud? We have the Bible." And I asked her, "Have you ever actually read Freud? Could you name anything that he's actually written? Do you know the difference between projection and reaction formation, or how he distinguished between the conscience and the ego ideal, or the difference between suppression or repression?" Whatever you think of him, he's one of the dominant minds in the 20th century. He got the Goethe Prize for his influence on the German language. Brilliant neurologist and doctor and father of psychoanalysis. And you're telling me you think he can be dismissed and you can't tell me the title of a single thing he wrote? It was the last time my mom asked me about psychology. Now, it turns out that Mom may have been right about Freud, but far too often Christians end up passing judgment on statements from the scientific community with no good reason at all. Luther called Copernicus an upstart astrologer. Possibly because Copernicus dedicated his works to the Pope and not to Luther. But within 2 generations, Mark Knoll writes about this in Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, within 2 generations, all of the leaders of the Reformation Church accepted a new view of the solar system. Moving slowly before passing theological judgments on scientific theory is one of the ways that we can love God with all of our minds, and how our world needs the gift of humility from those of us who speak in, with, and for the church. And then a second gift, wonderful gift, is the gift of curiosity. Just curiosity. My wife and I had our first grandchild this last year. He's now 10 months old. If we had known how wonderful grandchildren are, we would have skipped kids and gone directly to grandchildren. And the sense of curiosity and wonder. I recently read a book about curiosity, and the interpretation of the author on Genesis 3 was very interesting. It was that the story of the fall in the Bible is actually anti-curiosity, that curiosity is what led to the fall, that people are supposed to believe whatever religious authorities tell them to believe. And of course, far too often, people of faith, and particularly leaders in faith communities, have acted as though that were true. Religious leaders have abused authority in many, many ways, but that's one of them. But there's a wonderful little book by Roger Wagner and Andrew Biggs. Some of you will have read it. One of them is a scientist and one is an artist, called The Penultimate Curiosity: How Science Swims in the Slipstream of Faith. And they note that human beings need to make sense of the world as a whole. This is a need that will never go away. And this is ultimate curiosity. And then we have a drive to understand the physical cosmos, and this they call penultimate curiosity. Penultimate curiosity, physical curiosity, is grounded in metaphysical curiosity. And many of you will know much better than I do the work of historians of science, who will often tell us that to a very significant extent, what helped for science to emerge in humanity was religious thought, and particularly Christianity, the view that the universe was the product of an orderly God, a reasonable God, and yet a God who was also unpredictably creative and so would require empirical research. Alfred North Whitehead, when he was asked what made it possible for science to emerge, a fascinating response, he said it was the medieval insistence on the rationality of God. And Newton and Kepler and Galileo and Copernicus and so many others were great people of science and people of faith. The explosion of technology in the Middle Ages happened largely in monastic communities. Mechanical clocks were invented by monks because they needed to know when to pray. We first read about the invention of eyeglasses in a sermon around 1300 because monks needed to pore over texts. Champagne is associated with an actual French Benedictine monk named Dom Perignon, because there were not yet Baptists to tell him it was a sin to drink it. Monasteries were in some ways the Silicon Valley of the Middle Ages, the medieval world. And lack of curiosity is in fact a sin. It is a failure to be interested in what our great God has done. We need to bring the gift of humility, but then the gift of curiosity. And then, and this one is very important, we need to bring the gift of knowledge. The prophet, speaking for God, said, "My people perish for lack of knowledge." Now, we live in a day, of course, when the question of who has knowledge is hotly contested, partly because knowledge means authority, and authority means power. And often it is thought that something has to be proven in a scientific or mathematical way in order to constitute knowledge. But there are questions that we must ask that science cannot answer. My favorite Shakespeare production that I have ever seen took place when I took my son Danny to it to see Hamlet on Alcatraz Island. And the production actually started on the boat as we were going across, and they started with the very beginning of that play in an unexpected way. So this was experimental theater, that it was fabulously well done. And it was remarkable to walk on, if you've ever been to Alcatraz, and this was at night, and we were the only ones there, on that lonely island, and then in that prison where prisoners had sat. And to hear again those words. The most riveting moment came when we were huddled together in a dark cell in the middle of Alcatraz prison, and the most famous monologue in English literature began, "To be or not to be, that is the question." And precisely in that moment, it's a true story, a cell phone rang. And I thought, this is brilliant. They're having someone call to give the answer to the greatest question in history. This is just brilliant theater. And then I realized it was my phone. And they all thought I was in the play. And so I took it and answered it and turned to everybody and said, "It's better to be." It turns out that there actually is an answer to that question. See? The author of the play phoned in a response. Genesis 1, it is good, it is good, it is good. It is better for things to be than not to be. It is better for us to be than not to be. It is better for you to be. And this is not a preference or an opinion. It is not culturally determined. It is not biologically programmed. It is knowledge. It is true. But it is not scientific knowledge. People often assume that faith is opposed to knowledge in our day. Steve Pinker, who most of you will know, wrote, universities are about reasoned, pure, and simple faith, believing things without good reason to do so, has no place in anything but a religious institution. A friend of mine who works in the academy said, anybody who believes that universities are about reason, pure, and simple has never sat on a faculty committee. Luke is quite careful to record in the book of Acts, for example, that Paul reasons. He uses this word quite precisely in the marketplace as well as the synagogue with Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. Christianity, the Christian understanding of how things are for the first several centuries of the church, as you all know, did not grow by avoiding rational consideration through the imposition of authority. It grew by inviting rational consideration, often in opposition to authority. We live in a day when people are urged to consider that life's most important questions: what is the good life? Who is a good person? How do you become a good person? What should I live for? Are matters of preference or tradition, but not of knowledge. In other words, we live in a day where, to a large extent, educated people teach us to believe that where knowledge is most desperately needed, it has become most apparently unavailable. And the result is we are plagued by skepticism, cynicism, confusion, uncertainty, doubt, and eventually despair. And by contrast, the biblical writers insist that what is being presented is knowledge. Peter says, make every effort to add to your faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge. The gospel writer Luke says he very carefully investigated his writings so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. This does not mean that Christians are to be arrogant, quite the contrary. It does not mean that we are untroubled by questions or doubts. Paul put it like this: for now we know in part, we see through a glass darkly. Some of you will know a biologist named David Baresh has published a book just in the last year or two called Through a Glass Brightly. And it's a deliberate contrast with Paul's language. And among other things, in the book, he claims that science has now shown what religion could not, which is, this is a quote, that the reality that life in general and our individual life in particular is inherently meaningless. But if life is inherently meaningless, what is the point of writing a book about it? More than that, name a single empirical study in a single peer-reviewed journal in a single branch of any of the sciences that claims to have discovered that life in general and individual life in particular is inherently meaningless. There is a little phrase about knowledge that your mom used that has a deep meaning. You know better, your mom would say. She didn't say you have a better opinion or a better tradition. She would say you know better. Knowing right from wrong. Right and wrong is a clue to the meaning of the universe. Knowing right from wrong is essential to humanity, and wise people have always understood this. And even in our secular age, I find it fascinating that the defining hallmark of sanity in the judicial system is the capacity to know right from wrong. A conversation with faith and science has so much richness to add to life's knowledge. Last month at our church, the sermon was just an interview that I did with a man named Kyle Van Houten. Some of you might know Kyle. He's the director of science at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and a brilliant scientist. He got his master's in evolutionary biology at Stanford, got his PhD from Duke and his Master of Divinity from Duke. Stanley Hauerwas was on his science dissertation committee. And he talked about how one of the reasons that he wanted to go into science, one of the why questions, was that he was troubled by the notion of species becoming extinct. And this is part of what he said, just to quote. He said, I went to study the stewardship of creation because I didn't want extinction to happen. Extinction is obviously a bad thing, and I learned the word extinction actually did not originate in some scientific journal. It originated in the Book of Common Prayer, in the baptismal prayer for children, that the pouring of the water on the child would render thy sins extinct. It would put out the fire of their sin. It would extinguish it like a candle. Extinction is not just some scientific description. After he did that talk with our church and we posted it online, they found out about it at the aquarium, and the people who work at his aquarium asked if he would do that talk there. So he wrote in and said, I'm going to talk for about 40 folks that work at the aquarium. Most of them would identify as skeptics or atheists, so would you pray for that? People are hungry to talk about ultimate questions, the gift of knowledge. And if you are a leader at a church, you are a steward of moral and spiritual knowledge, not a tradition, not values, not a history. My people perish for lack of knowledge. And then one last gift, and this is a little more metaphorical: humility, curiosity, knowledge, and then a song. Our world needs a song. Part of why we will lead into worship tonight. That is, a way to communicate the great story that will evoke wonder and delight and longing. A good song has profoundly rich cognitive content, but it also expresses beauty and joy in a way that reach the core of our souls. And that is why in the Bible, creation and song so often go together. Dozens of places. This is just from Job, where God says, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation, who laid its cornerstone, while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Wouldn't you like to have been there to hear the stars singing and the angels shouting for joy? And the alternative to that song is despair. Have you ever wondered why atheism or secularism or skepticism or nihilism doesn't tend to produce great music? This is from Bertrand Russell. Russell wrote, purposeless, void of meaning is the world. Man's growth, his hopes and fears, his loves, his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. No fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual beyond the grave. All the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system. The whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of the universe in ruins. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation be safely built. Maybe so, but that's a hard song to sing to your kids at night. How firm a foundation is total despair. We'll all be dead soon, dear, so what should I care? When you're in the grave, you will not make a peep. So shut up your pie hole and let mommy sleep. That's a hard song to sing to the kids. At our church, I devoted one whole sermon a couple of years ago to Stephen Hawking when the film A Theory of Everything came out. And it was a wonderful conversation to have together with our church. As it happened at that week, our church, the original campus is 2 miles from Stanford. On Monday, there was a big announcement, some of you will remember this, of the Breakthrough Initiative, a $100 million search for intelligent life. And the primary center for it was Cal Berkeley. And I told our church on Tuesday, Stanford announced a project to search for intelligent life at Berkeley. But you have to go to our church to appreciate that. I apologize. Here was Stephen Hawking's incredibly poignant comment on that. It is important to know if we are alone in the dark. It is important to know if we are alone in the dark. It is not good for man to be alone. We know this. We know that what he is talking about is hope. And the testimony of the most reliable witnesses, starting with Jesus, is that there is hope. And so we have a song to sing. One of the reasons I believe Christianity to be true is that it understands the relationship between knowledge and love so deeply. A real smart guy a long time ago put it like this: we know that we all possess knowledge, but knowledge puffs up, while love builds up. Those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know, but whoever loves God is known by God. We have a song. Richard Foster writes about a dad who was a real smart guy, and then he had a baby, a little boy, and it was the strangest thing. That little guy did not care how smart his dad was at all. He was in a grocery store, and the little 3-year-old guy was fussing and whining and cranky and wouldn't stop, and his dad is whispering quietly, "It's okay, Lucas. We'll be done soon, Lucas. You can handle this, Lucas." And a woman hears him and says, "You're so patient with your son, Lucas." And he said, "No, my son's name is Wendell. I'm Lucas." And then he doesn't know what else to do, so he begins to sing his son a song, and it's kind of a goofy song with a made-up melody, and he makes up the words as he goes along. "I'm so glad you're my son. I'm so glad I get to be your dad. I love seeing your face. It makes me happy when you smile. I love sometimes at night when you don't know to go in and look at your little body when you're sound asleep. I love dreaming of what you'll be one day when you grow up. I want you to know that whatever happens, wherever you go, whatever you do, I will always love you. I will always be your daddy. You will never be alone in the dark." And Wendell gets really quiet, and his eyes get real wide, and his face gets really still, and his heart gets really calm. And he listens all the way out to the car, and his daddy puts him in the seat and gets in the front to drive off. And Wendell says, "Sing it to me again, Daddy." Because you never get too old for that song. Preachers and theologians and biologists and physicists, we have a song to sing of doxological fascination. Others have sung it well before us, glorious voices and brilliant minds. But this is our day. Let's sing it again.